Oh, you caught my guest Feylyn having her last drink of water.
Oh, no parched mouth over here.
Well, it's empty. I don't have my water. I forgot to refill it. Well, I guess I'll be parched throughout our interview. I'm so happy today to have another bright, energetic woman to speak with. I love connecting with my female colleagues out there. I like we were just talking about actually, Feylyn and I, how important it is for us women to help each other and also to acknowledge our value and our experience and ask to get paid for it, which is not easy as social workers. Feylyn, my guest, has her doctorate in social work. I only have my measly master's. So she's far exceeded me in her education. But today we're going to be talking about a really important topic for which Feylyn has actual personal experience with. But first, I just want to say the weather is nice today, finally in Montreal. I just had my lunch outside and I'm kind of like schwitzing a bit, like, oh, it was so nice to be sitting outside today. We've been struggling with a lot of rain these days. So anyways, I'm in a very good mood because I had some vitamin D straight into my face. So have you ever had these thoughts, perhaps when you were younger, like, does this boy in school like me? Is he going to pass me a note? I have so much homework to do. Hey, I want to go thrifting. Hey, let's meet up at the bar. Oh, should we take a gap year and travel around Europe? These are the thoughts that young people should be having, right? This is what they should be focused on. And we know with COVID that already a lot of that has been removed. I know it's been really hard for my two teenagers who want to experience life in a way that they can't right now. They want to definitely be away from their annoying parents and off with their friends doing things. And here in Montreal, everything is still basically closed. So, and it has been since the beginning of the pandemic. So I think the world is kind of understanding the impact of isolation and what the lack of connection can do to people. And we're going to be talking about that today, but in the context of young caregivers. And I'm very excited to have Dr. Feylyn Lewis with us. Very skilled woman, very educated. Check this out. So she has her doctorate in philosophy of social work. She also has a law degree because, one thing wasn't enough, and a master's in community counseling. Okay, so check, overachiever.
I need to sleep.
Yeah, exactly. You can sleep at the end of your life, right? Or what they say, well, I'll sleep when I'm dead. But talk about education. And she has traveled all over the world giving keynote talks, and now she's a researcher with the University of Sussex. And it's just great to have you here, Feylyn. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk about this really important issue.
Yeah, it's good to have you. And hi to Shir, who just said hi to us, to Shir Patel, who's on LinkedIn, I think I'm trying to see in the feed. So hello to you. Thanks for being here with us. So first, Feylyn, you mentioned to me in a very small snapshot, I didn't want to get into it offline, that you yourself were a young caregiver, and that's what really started you in terms of following this in your career research and trying to bring attention to this issue. Talk to me a bit about your own personal caregiving journey.
Sure. So for me, caregiving started at a very young age. When I was 11 years old, my mother, who was ordinarily very healthy, she was a registered nurse. She was running marathons in Alaska, living her best life with me and my older brother, Farrell. We have a 7-year age difference. And she unfortunately was diagnosed with degenerative disc disease, and she needed to have what's quite a routine surgery for that condition. And unfortunately, the surgeon took out bones from her spine that he shouldn't have, and the surgery just went wrong. And my mother was really expected to be in the hospital just a weekend, but she ended up needing to go through rehab for weeks on end, working on walking again, and she was actually classified as permanently disabled. So she was no longer able to return to work as a labor and delivery nurse. So yeah, that's
intense. That's like, and for a young kid too. And when our family members go into surgery, of course we have some reservations about it, but it's like I'm sure it was a necessary surgery. but it probably wasn't a life or death surgery either, right? And so then now she's permanently impacted the rest of her life. And at the time, was your father, or in the picture, was your mother's husband there, or was it just you and your brother who ended up having to take on all the responsibility?
So just my older brother and myself. My parents are divorced, and so my father wasn't in the home. And all of my mom's care really fell on ourselves. So my brother was a young adult. He was going into his second year at college or university, for those that might be listening in from Europe. And he dropped out, actually, to come home to take care of my mom, and then also me in the home, also helping out with my mother. That meant wound care, and that meant showering, toileting, helping her get dressed, medications. And for my brother, that meant he took on a full-time job to now pay for our mortgage for our family home. All of our
Jesus.
lives are completely just upended, for a surgery gone wrong.
And so let me ask you, Phelan, I'm just curious how the healthcare system works when they realize that your mother is going to have these long-term care needs, and then, they have family meetings and there's a discharge plan. Was there an acknowledgement or like an open discussion, like this is a young adult and a child, and they are going to need additional resources, and let's recognize that they may not have the skills or the capacity or the desire to take on this role? Were there like active discussions, or it was like, oh, there's people at the home, dump, here you go?
I'm laughing, Stephanie, because what discharge plan?
Okay.
That
Yeah.
did not happen. No, not at all. No, no, no. We're really behind in that. What really needs to happen with healthcare systems is we do need to ask who's going to be at home when you leave this hospital room. Who's there? Because for our reality, it was someone who's 11 years old and 19. And in fact, my brother actually wasn't even living with us because he was away at college. So, going home to a child essentially. And so, yeah, and there wasn't anything like a discharge plan or family group conferences that we talk about. None of that happened. And if that had happened, then we would have perhaps been connected with resources like social workers or counselors or home health aides. But that didn't happen for our family. And I know that's the reality for millions of other families where disability or illness occurs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to bash all hospital systems, because there are a lot of hospitals that do really good discharge planning. And I've been involved in many of these meetings and with my colleagues. And so I know that it exists. So I'm not bashing. But even right now, Phelan, so my stepbrother is not in good health. He's in heart failure, and we're waiting to get the news. He's getting a heart transplant. He's in the hospital right now waiting for it. So it's pretty intense. But the discharge plan for the social worker was that he goes home with my mom and my stepdad. My mom is 78, my stepdad is 84, and it looks like he has a diagnosis of Parkinson's and or dementia. They're still working it out. There's no way my mom and her husband can do this, and it's like they're not even considering it, and it's very frustrating. And for you and your brother, the same kind of frustration is like, we're kids. What position have you just put us in? But I guess you had no choice.
Exactly. Yeah.
And for young caregivers, do you find in all the research that you've been doing that this is the typical entry into the young caregiver world, where it's like an acute event, and now all of a sudden young caregivers are thrown into the responsibility without any prep or guidance?
I think actually you might hear it one of two ways. So there could be young caregivers like my experience, who, as you said, acute, sudden, unexpected. But what you often hear from children and young adults is that actually it was something that, as long as they can remember, they've been caregiving. So if they have a parent or grandparent or sibling with a chronic condition, for as long as they remember, so since early childhood, they've had some type of caregiving role in the family. So I think you might hear both actually.
Okay, and for those chronic situations, the things that popped in my mind as I was prepping for our conversation was chronic situations might be something like a sibling who has some sort of a disability, and that's chronic. And so their parents might be there, but they're still playing like a secondary role, or the let me cheer you up and be nice to my brother role, right? Which is part of caregiving too. Or I was thinking about mental illness, which to me, that probably would be the thing that would be certainly less visible, and probably less talked about, because we don't want to tell our friends, my mom has schizophrenia, my dad has bipolar disorder, or whatever. Is that accurate, that mental illness is one of the more like secretive young caregiving situations?
Yeah, and I'd also add substance abuse as well.
Yes, yes, of course.
Yeah, I think because of the shame element, particularly if you have a child caring for a parent with mental illness or substance abuse, I think sometimes we can still problematize the parent. So, and especially if it's a mother, be seen as you're neglectful or you're a bad parent. And I think that cycle of shame can then make sure it really engenders a family to not speak out because you're afraid of social services getting involved or perhaps the law getting involved. And it really just means that caregiving, which already is a private matter in the home for many families, it becomes even more hidden and kept quiet.
And for young caregivers, I mean, what age span are you talking about when you do? I mean, I realize that the research is probably divided among different groups, but when you're out there saying young caregivers need attention, they need support, what's the age span you're talking about?
Mm. So for me, I think a lot of people are really surprised to hear that young caregiving can start at a really early age. So it would not be unheard of to hear of toddlers of some type of caregiving responsibility. Yeah, yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
okay, so before you go on with ages, you just stop me in my tracks.
Yeah.
Give me an example of what a toddler would have to do and or their entry into caregiving.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it could be things like household tasks. So, could be cooking. You may not have them cleaning. I mean, you may not have them cooking, I should say, but you may have them cleaning. You may have them retrieving things. So, saying, "Oh, go get mom's medication off the table. Come bring that here." You start to see them that entryway into what we would say normally more mature adult tasks. You start to see them beginning to pick up at early ages.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so toddler, that's crazy. Toddler, and then oh, and actually, side note, I've read stories here and there where like a 4-year-old calls 911 because the parent has epilepsy and they already had taught them how to call 911 for help and those kinds of things. So, yeah, now that you're mentioning it, it does make sense. So, we're talking as young as toddlerhood, and then when you talk about young caregivers, what's the limit of that age group?
Yeah, well, I guess you're only as young as you feel.
That's right. I'm a young caregiver.
So, yeah, I'm still claiming that. But I generally look at again toddler age to millennials.
Millennials,
Yeah,
okay.
so I think that's now about the early 40s now. So that's what we tend to look through with research.
And that must be really challenging for the development of services and programs because the needs of someone who's 4 and 5, 11,
Mhm.
17, 23. I mean, talk about a range of resources and support that you need. So, how does your research help to maybe generate ideas or programs that would be specific to each age group? How can you do that on your end as a researcher?
Right. So for myself as a researcher, it's about going in and asking questions. So actually asking those specific age groups. A lot of my work has focused on adolescence and young adulthood years, just because I'm really interested in the psychology behind the transition to adulthood. But what you want to do as a researcher is just ask questions. So, what is your specific need as a teenager, as someone in junior high, as someone who's 7 or 8 years old, or someone who's perhaps maybe in a sandwich generation caregiving as a millennial? You've got your own children, and then you may be also still caring for a sibling, a parent, or grandparent. So definitely, I'd say the first thing is ask questions, find out about what their experience is like, because I think that's really only by listening, careful listening, are we able to find out what will best support them and their specific age range. And that's what I found most useful to my work.
And so, in your research, can you kind of give me a snapshot of the different age groups? Let's say we divide it into childhood, adolescence, young adults, millennials, I guess. Can you give me a snapshot of what the generalized needs? I mean, obviously, there's a range, but the most common needs and issues that these different age groups are coming across. Let's start with childhood.
Sure. I think actually the most common thing I'm hearing across all age groups would be they want someone to listen to them and someone to talk to. So I think I had been
Even teenagers say that? Sorry. I have teenagers, like, the last thing they want is for me to listen to them or talk to them. Sorry. I
Makes
know.
sense, yeah. So yeah, someone often you may hear that it may be someone trusted outside of the home, because I think with caregiving, this is true for caregiving of all ages. You have a lot of feelings of guilt. You don't want to seem like you are complaining or making your person that you may very well indeed love, and feel there's a sense of duty for caring for them. You don't want to seem like they're a burden. So often emotions and feelings are kept silent and are kept pushed inward. So having someone even outside the home that's trusted, that understands, that can point them to what resources that may be available for them, having that adult in their life is something that I hear across all ages, and that's still really not present enough. Because I think the way young caregiving is still so under recognized in society, there's just really a lack for that. So I would say that's the first commonality is again someone they can speak to. In childhood years, what you're going to hear is wanting support for education and school. So
Mhm.
unfortunately, if you are a youth caregiver or a child caregiver, a young caregiver, all the different words we throw out there, what you may find is it's really difficult to balance homework, studying for tests, with the needs of your family and the contributions that you're making to your family as a caregiver. So children are tired, they're exhausted, they may not be able to get a full night's sleep. So in the classroom, they're presenting as children who are sleepy, they may not have their assignments completed. And sometimes they can be labeled the problem child in a classroom. And that's really unfortunate because school is actually, I'd say, the first gateway to perhaps more supportive services for those children. But for many of them, that actually can be a place where they, again, feel under recognized or unrecognized by the professionals that are in their life.
Yeah, because even if, let's say, they're having academic issues or behavioral problems in the classroom, and then they're sent to, I'll say, the principal's office, but end up with the assistant principal or a social worker or someone in the school, that wouldn't be a normal question that we would start right off the bat asking, are you caring for somebody in your home? But that's a really good point to make, is that we have to recognize as an educational system as well, because you are that pathway, that gateway, a very protective, safe environment for kids who experience, violence in the home or poverty in the home, and they're hungry. That's the link, right? So that does seem to be a piece of additional education that maybe those support systems in the school could have, is understanding the full family dynamics and not being afraid to ask those more specific questions. Is your mom well? Is your father well? Very specifically, to give that child the space to say, no, we're having some problems.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm especially thinking that's so important now with the time of COVID, because what we're going to have now is with long haul COVID or long COVID, what you might hear, you're going to have a new crop, in my view, of first time young caregivers. So if you know that a family has been affected by coronavirus, I really encourage school administrators, teachers, school counselors, school nurses, actually ask, are you caring for someone in your family? Have they been sick with coronavirus? Because I think you may find with the way that long COVID is looking like, where it's going to be several months of shortness of breath and all these different symptoms we're still learning about, that children for the first time are going to be placed into new caregiving roles that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, not to mention the not only the physical parts of COVID, but the increased mental health
Mhm.
concerns that we're having for people over all this time of isolation and stuff. So, just to get back, we were talking about the different, like, things that you've learned about the age groups and what it is they're asking for. So you talked about one of the things they want is to have someone to talk to. The second thing that they are bringing up is they want support in their educational pursuit, whatever that might be. Is there anything else that's come up in your research in terms of what young caregivers are looking for?
Right. So for adolescents and teenagers and that transition to young adulthood, what you're going to hear next after those first two things will be money. So help with finances, because at that age, 16, 17, 18, you may be able to start your own employment. So working outside of the home. So they may be taking on one jobs, two jobs, to be able to start financially contributing to their family. And then juggling school, juggling the thoughts of can they go off to college or university? Is that the right path for them? Will they be able to leave their family? to do that. So financial impacts are some of the things we start to think about with when you hit the teenage and young adulthood years of transition. And then going on to those that are a bit older, so us millennials, then you're going to hear certainly the same, but then also you get more concerned about career balance. So not only now are you trying to balance family caregiving, but then it's also on to, okay, I'm entering into the actual career force. In some positions, you may need to have time to have networking after work. That sometimes can just be a no-go, a no-starter for those that got to get home to caregive for someone. So those are the things that you start thinking about, the effects onto education, employment, career, and then also romantic partnerships. That's also something,
Totally. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. You love life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think sometimes it can be quite difficult, I think, to balance, new relationships, and that may also be romantic partnerships, but it could also be friendships as well, with caregiving. What I found in my research so far is that young caregivers seek out friends and romantic partnerships with those that often tend to be caregivers themselves in some capacity. Why? Because it's a safe space. It's people who understand, they can relate to them, they understand that actually I'm too busy for date night tonight. I've got to go help my mom. I've got to go do this. Like they understand their last minute cancellations. Um, that's really helps kind of fuel their choice and partnerships. What I've also found though sometimes is that if they've been caring for someone from a very early age, they actually may want to delay having children of their own, or even not at all wanting to have a family. And sometimes you may hear it's because, well, I've had my own version of a child, may that being their family member that they care for from a very young age, and they're wanting a break. So yeah, there's caregiving affects so many different spheres of life.
Totally. And these are not even the challenges of the actual physical execution of the tasks involved, which is for caregivers everywhere, right? These are all of the additional issues above and beyond. So, first of all, we know we're lacking in resources. That we already know. But before we get to that, let me just talk about the identification of, because, with most problems that anybody has, you have to go all the way back to first we have to identify what the problem is and obtain information on what people need in order to implement it and then connect them. So if we go backwards, in my mind, it would be the healthcare system that is really the portal to helping us change this dynamic and support structure for young caregivers, because it's going to be the physicians and the nurses and the social workers and physiotherapists and occupational therapists, those in the healthcare world that will hear and understand that something is happening and then be able to make that first link. So I don't know if you agree with that. If you do or don't, please tell me. And then what would be your alternate suggestions as to how we can kind of make a change and a path for movement?
Right. Yeah, I definitely think healthcare is a big part of this. If you're experiencing something like what our family did, which it was acute, it was sudden, it was unexpected. In our case, healthcare professionals are the first point of contact to pointing us to resources. I'll put a pin in that and say what you often hear though is, what if we identify all of these children, young adults, but there's no services for them? There's nothing dedicated for them. So after that, what do we do once we know they're here? Where are we going to pinpoint them? And so it's also about working together in identification, but then also working jointly with the support services aspect. And unfortunately, we're really lacking in the U.S. For dedicated services for young caregivers. There's organizations like the American Association for Caregiving Youth, based in Boca Raton, Florida. But unfortunately, we just do not have organizations widely across our nation to really specifically, I should say, work with children and young adults. So there's definitely the healthcare piece, I'd say. Also, we've mentioned education, particularly for the younger age of caregivers. That's again another gateway into some support and services and a trusted adult to listen to. I'd also talk about employment spaces being caregiver friendly, and that's something that will not just help younger caregivers, but also the baby boomer population, even those that are older that are still in the
Yeah.
workforce. So, yeah, I think there's so many opportunities for society to really jump in. And help.
Yeah. And I would assume that one of the challenges to develop resources for this area, number one, we have to identify, and we've already talked about some of the barriers of even the identification of, but even let's say every young caregiver was identified. If you match that number by number to the other types of caregiving, it's probably going to fall short in terms of numbers. And so then when you have a pool of resources, the money goes to the most pressing needs. So, for example, something like Alzheimer's and dementia caregivers, they're probably going to get more funding and more services because it's widely recognized, people know about it more, the conversation's already started. So it's definitely a battle that those who are like yourself, researchers and other advocates for young caregivers have, because you don't have the visibility or the numbers yet to say, hey, we're here, we need some of these resources too.
Yeah. I would say, I feel like I bet we do have the numbers, but that's where we need
Mm.
more research. Yeah, I would say that if you have a family where there's perhaps maybe injuries from military service or
Mm.
abuse,
Oh,
yeah, you're gonna have young caregivers in the home. So I think actually those numbers are really underrepresented, and we don't know enough. We really lack national research in the U.S. And for a lot of countries that's actually true, to be honest, around the world. So I would actually say I think the numbers are there, but I think you're right about other groups having attention, particularly in lobbying and support organizations. I think you're right about that. I'd also say I think as well. Young adults are really combating, I think, some myths, particularly for millennials, about being narcissistic, about being so focused on themselves. That, in fact, when I was actually doing my research and going around to different cities around the east coast of the country, what I'd sometimes hear from professionals is, oh, well, young adults, they're so, into themselves, so centered. Like, it's really hard for me to imagine someone stopping and taking care of someone in their family. Like, I can't picture that. And
wow.
yeah, so I think there's still some myths out there of the avocado toast eating millennial who's very inward focused and not so focused on the world around them. And so I think part of my role as an advocate is just speaking out against that. But I'd also say I think as well with children specifically, there's the issues about social services getting involved, that fear, and so that again that creates that group of silence. But I think also you just have children and young adults who, to use a British phrase, just getting on with it. Um, they are not being recognized by those that they're coming into contact with, and there hasn't been like a revolution yet or activism yet that we've seen with some other groups, and perhaps maybe the disability rights sphere that we've seen with young caregiving yet. That hasn't happened. I think a lot of it has to do with lack of time. There's not a lot of time to organize and have protests on the streets, but that's what I think we need.
Yeah.
Bring attention to it.
Oh, I agree with you. And I'm so glad you said that too about veterans too and young caregivers. And you're right, even myself in this field, that wasn't the first thought that came to my mind. So, number one, that challenge is we got to get to all of these national groups that are specific for particular illnesses or populations like veterans or whatever it might be, mental illness, whatever it might be, and collect all of that data. Make sure that all those researchers are including questions about young caregivers, and then get all that data together, which will help bring visibility. You also just brought up activism, and that was actually a point in my notes, which are taped to my computer screen, so I don't forget to ask, that I wanted to talk about, because young people to me are amazing. What are they are doing now for different movements has just been incredible. The Black Lives Matters movement, led and supported by all of these youth, LGBTQ issues, supported and led by all of these groups. I mean, it's incredible what young people are doing. The environment, oh my God, young people are like all on board and in an uproar about the environment. So youth have this incredible outlook on life, an incredible perspective. They have such spirit, and they're less hopeless because they have so much more time in front of them, right? So they really feel that urgency so that their whole life that is in front of them is better. How, with the youth that you've met, there's just a two-part question. With the youth that you've come across during your research, do you see that piece of them, like that fire burning, where if they were given the right environment and support, they could kind of lead the charge? And what have you learned from the people that you've met in terms of all of the power that comes within being a young caregiver, and how they can use that not only to activate for other advocate for other young caregivers, but just their own life?
Okay. Yeah, what I hear most, the emotion that I connect with is actually anger.
Hmm.
These are young people who've, well, as we mentioned, have likely been caregiving for a long time, have given up quite a bit, have very different experiences from their non-caregiving peers. They may feel shortchanged on some of the opportunities in life. But I want to say that because we talk a lot about the negative aspects of caring. They also love their families. They have bonds. Of course. So I want to make sure we always mention the positive aspects of caregiving. But the reality is, though, that sometimes the negative aspects can really I guess, overshadow the caregiving experience. So, anger is actually what I hear a lot from the young people that I talk to. Anger that they're not being recognized, anger that there's not specific support groups for them or any kind of support services, anger that other systems have really let their family down. And I hope that we can kind of harness that anger because I think you're right. Young people do have a vibrancy there that exists in terms of being able to really spark change. But I think caregivers, and of course any age, are really battling against the time element.
Mhm.
So much of our time is is really focused into caregiving. So being able to advocate for ourselves, I think for me, can happen in small ways, but can actually be really revolutionary. So that may mean remembering that you have a right to be happy, you have a right to thrive, you have a right to have hope for your future. And I want to say that, of course, recognizing the realities that for some people, many doors may feel very closed to them. But I don't want young people to lose that hope that if you want to go off to college and university, that there's some way we can make that happen. That may be maybe community college, or that may be going part-time, or it may I think there's ways that we can I would encourage young people to think creatively about how they can still kind of grab hold to their dreams and don't lose them, because I think when you do lose those dreams for the future, that's when you become hopeless. And I unfortunately didn't talk a lot today about the mental health aspects of caregiving with some of the issues of depression and suicidal thoughts that I do hear from
Well,
young
I'm sure you do. Yeah.
that. So you're right about the hope element. We have to keep hope alive, to use a very cliched phrase. But I'd say advocating for yourself is a first step. And I think it's a huge step, actually, because I think of the ways that we like to think of caregivers being selfless and angels and sacrificial. But we also have to remember that they have their own lives and there's autonomy and they have a right to that. So I would say speaking up, and even if it's a small ways in the doctor's office or at school, don't be afraid to be the squeaky wheel and keep banging on doors. And hopefully, with you have advocates like ourselves who are joining young people in that to be able to knock down those walls. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Phelan, you said so many things as you were talking. I was wanted to, but I don't want to interrupt you, especially because then it breaks the audio too. But so many things you said. First of all, the mental health aspect. We know that anger turned inward as social workers. We know this becomes depression and can turn into suicidal thoughts. So what I think has worked really well with the Black Lives Matters movement is people are pissed, rightfully so. They're pissed at systems or the police system, the political system, the legal system, and that anger has taken years, but finally feels like there has been, thank God, with the conviction for the George Floyd death. I mean, I'm hoping that this is the beginning of something, um, but it's taken a lot of anger for many years, and I'm so glad that that group has hung on to it because I think it's catapulted the movement. I hope. But I'm sure that we've lost some people along the way who that anger just became too much for them. So I totally hear that point that we have to check in with the mental health aspects. One of the things you talked about on the onset of our interview was that young caregivers want to talk. And so if we can at least just provide that additional, that minimal resource at the beginning of share your anger with me, perhaps we can transform that anger, prevent it from turning into depression and additional issues, and use that anger to find small moments where you feel like what you're doing matters for you personally, for your family, and maybe even a step beyond the next patient who walks into that doctor's office, because movements don't have to be large. We can, with one conversation with, I know something happened that's a bit off topic, but our dentist, my husband and my husband's mom goes to the same dentist. And I don't know, 4 months ago when she was there, he started telling her not to get a vaccine. And he started giving all his reasons why he didn't think she should get a vaccine. And my husband told me this, and I'm like, I'm going to call him and give him a piece of my mind. He's not her physician.
Mm.
He's not a doctor, he's a dentist. First of all, he's stepped outside of his practice and giving advice on something else. That's a whole other issue. But I said, and so my husband's like, I'm not letting you call because you're going to go off and it's going to be ineffective, which is probably a good call. But he went and saw him and had a conversation with him. So even though my husband wasn't, shouting from the rooftops, stay within your lane, hopefully he impacted the practice of this one dentist. And that's the point I'm trying to make, is that young caregivers, just with those small moments, can really create great change. And so you're right. We need to meet them there and help them feel like they can be effective in their own lives and others' lives, because it can be very empowering.
Mhm. That's right. Yeah, absolutely. I don't have anything to add to that, Stephanie. That's great. Let's get started.
Yeah, let's go. All right, here we go. Feylyn, is there anything else that you want to add before we close off? How can people get a hold of you and your work? We just talked about you don't have a website yet. So if people want to hear about you and your work, do they go to the University of Sussex? How do they find you?
So I'm on Twitter, and that's probably the best, easiest way and most accessible way to catch me. So I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter, all social media channels. Do feel free to reach out and let's have a conversation. I'm so thankful to advocates like yourself, Stephanie, for having the space and the time to have conversations like today. They're so important, and we need people like this, to have these conversations, to understand and get the issues at hand. So thank you. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for everybody who's tuning in. Feylyn, hang on just a minute. I'm going to stop the broadcast, but hang on. And thank you again for being here. Okay.